Marie-Claude Geoffroy. I'm an associate professor in psychiatry at McGill, and I'm the representative as well of the GRIP, le groupe de recherche sur une adaptation psychosociale de l'enfant at McGill. And today we are very, very lucky because we have Brett Thombs with us today. We'll talk about reporting guidelines. And I have the honor of introducing Dr. Thombs this morning, and after I read his biography, you will understand why it's such an honor. So, Dr. Thombs completed his PhD in clinical psychology at Fordham University in 2004. Then he was a postdoc fellow at the Johns Hopkins University. He began his career at McGill in 2006, and now is a full professor and Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill. Dr. Thombs has published over 380 peer-reviewed articles, many in the world's top medical journals, and has been awarded almost $25 million in grant funding as a principal investigator. He funded NDirects, the Scleroderma Patient Intervention Network, the SPIN, a collaboration of over 150 investigators, healthcare providers, patients, and patient advocates from 9 countries and 50 scleroderma expert centers. The SPIN maintains a cohort of over 2,000 people with the rare autoimmune disease, systemic sclerosis, and conducts trials to address problems prioritized by patients. Dr. Thombs also funds the NDirects, the Depression Screening Data, the DEPRESS project, which currently includes more than 350 investigators from over 50 countries who have contributed to over 300 primary data sets to conduct individual participant data meta-analysis to address gaps in evidence on depression screening tools. He also leads high-profile meta-research to improve research methods and reporting, and has led major clinical and research guidelines. Dr. Thombs was the chair of the Canadian Task Force on Preventive Healthcare from 2017 to 2021, the first non-physician in his role. So, welcome to Dr. Thombs.
Okay, so thanks so much, Marie-Claude, and thank you for the invitation. I apologize that I won't be able to do this in French. I could do this in Spanish now or English. Well, I'll do it in English, but not French. I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to go a little bit beyond reporting guidelines, but it will focus on the idea of how you can do research that matters, and I won't go into all of how to do research that matters, but doing something that matters and doing it transparently and completely enough that people can use it. As I'll talk about later, a lot of research, when it gets to the stage of doing guidelines or being used, just gets thrown out and disregarded by people developing guidelines altogether. And whatever research you're doing, someone's paying for it. You're all at the point where your skills are valuable. You could be doing something else. So if you're doing something that's not useful, you're wasting your own time and you're wasting the money of the people here in Quebec that pay for you, right? So just a quick disclosure that all of my team's funding is public funding, so we have no conflicts of interest with industry or otherwise. And so I'll talk a little bit today about why is it that we do health research, which I think is really critical to think about. Keep that in mind. What is research waste, and some things we can do about it, and then I'll go through some steps that we can't do everything about research waste, and we can't be perfect researchers, but there are things that we can do in each one of our studies. No matter if you're an undergraduate trying to do a thesis, or a graduate student, or a more senior investigator, there are steps that you can take that make it more likely that you're going to generate something that's useful for people, that people trust enough to use, and that when people go out and make guidelines and make decisions in their practices, they actually use your research and do it. So if I tend to talk really quickly, and especially if I get carried away. So if I'm going too quickly, please don't hesitate to signal me. I'm not offended. If you have any questions or comments during, just go ahead, let me know, interrupt, raise your hand, and we can address them. You can also email me later. And we'll try using Kahoot. It's a little survey game. Has anyone used that before, Kahoot? Yeah, my wife's a CCF teacher, so she says she thought this was good. I think it's good. We'll see. Okay, so just a quick bit of background. I'll talk about it because I think it's also important sometimes to figure out how we got here. So, like Marie-Claude said, I did my PhD at Fordham in clinical psychology. I did all clinical work. I did a thesis because I had to. Everyone in my cohort raised their hands, and we swore we wanted to be researchers, but nobody really wanted to be a researcher. It's how clinical psychology works. We all promise. And I'm the only person who ended up doing research, just not because I planned to. And it's a long story, but anyway. And I was at Johns Hopkins and at McGill. But in my research, as Marie-Claude said, a lot of what I do, and I'll tell you how I got here in a minute, has to do, I think, with solving problems that make research more useful. So one of the areas I work in is a rare disease called scleroderma. It means hard skin in Greek. So basically, if you imagine, here's a psychologist version of this medical condition. If you fall down and you wound yourself and get a scab, it scabs over and it protects your open wound, and then it falls off and you go on. Well, this disease is an autoimmune disease where that's going at a high rate all the time all over the body. So the skin becomes hard and internal organs can be rendered non-functional and so forth, and so it's a terrible disease. And one of the problems was that we virtually know nothing about problems important to patients. People were doing important medical research on stopping the lung disease, but no one was talking about all the problems they face. And it was really hard to do because you have very few people in any site. So the point of this is that we pulled together investigators from around the world. We pulled together patients who work with us in leadership. And we have a large cohort now of a couple thousand people, and we run trials. So the idea that we can actually, again, do research that people can actually use, right? It's useful enough. If we come together and bring in a methodologist to do it right, people can actually use our work. The other area I work in is evidence synthesis or systematic review in mental health screening. And this basically came out of the idea, again, trying to solve some problems that people always want to know if we have a test for detecting depression, how accurate it is. But the way you have to analyze these tests is that you have people who have the condition and people who don't have the condition. So if you think about it, people were running around in our field and still are. We have 200 people in your study sample and you think you're happy about it, but only 10 of them actually have depression. Imagine if you try to apply for a grant with 10 people in your sample size, and that's how many people you're using to estimate how accurately it finds them. People were publishing all sorts of results. Imagine with a sample size of 10, you're going to get anything, right? And it's not because you're doing it wrong, it's just by chance. So we pulled together large data sets, and as Michael said, we now have data sets of 50, 60,000 people for each screening tool, and we try to assess how accurate they can be used and give people better evidence on that. And then finally, I've been do as much as I can. This work is harder to, not so easy to fund, but we do as much as we can in what I call I don't call it, it's called meta research, or why research on research. And as John Ioannidis, who's probably the parent of a lot of fields, and he's one of the brightest people I know. Basically it's a study of research itself, right? And so I've been involved in doing this is a typical study that Tiffany Del Santo did. I thought this study, the headline there I thought was great because people that were doing research on reporting guidelines themselves were reporting their own research terribly. It was slop. So we went through, but we put a method together, and Tiffany went through for her master's thesis and really applied a method. Said, how are they actually reporting enough information to use their own studies that are critiquing reporting? Because even in meta research, there's a little industry of just generating slop that we all publish. But then I've also been involved in developing reporting guidelines, and I was part of the Canadian Task Force on Preventive Healthcare, which develops guidelines to advise in Canada for screening, basically anything preventive, so all screening, breast cancer, or prostate cancer, colorectal cancer, smoking cessation, things like that. So how did I get to here in meta research? I'll just try to give you, I think what this slide shows, I didn't have a direct path, but I think how I got here informed why I'm interested in why we're getting research right. So I actually graduated from Northwestern in Chicago with an econ and applied math degree and didn't know what to do. I hadn't really thought of a job, and everyone started showing up with suits on campus. So I thought, oh gosh, it's that time. And I got a job on Wall Street. I don't know how I got there. And I didn't like it very much. I wasn't there very long. And I'd always volunteered in a home for children who were, had behavioral problems that were too severe to be in a foster setting. And so they kept saying, come work here, and I kept thinking you pay $5 an hour, which they did. And then I went and worked there. And so I went there and got that. That wasn't a career path, so I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And meanwhile, I actually was in the Teamsters in Chicago, and I loaded trucks on it for about a year where all the produce comes into Chicago. I never told anybody there I went to university. It wasn't that kind of environment. And then I went to the University of Arizona, mostly to go backpacking in the Grand Canyon, but I also got my master's degree in special education, so began to work and then I worked as a special education teacher at Sierra Middle School in Tucson, Arizona, before I thought, that I wanted to learn Spanish, because so many people, I always wanted to. So I went to Mexico and lived in Mexico for a couple of years where I was teaching third grade in a bilingual school. And all along the way, I've done, a number of these things, like, I worked in restaurants, I worked as a doorman in a bar. I was a terrible doorman. I could never tell anyone to do anything. So, but anyway, in Chicago, and I worked in, landscaping in Arizona, and did all sorts of things. So, you can imagine that after I was in Mexico, I thought, my wife gave me the "what are you going to do with your life" talk. She really did. She claimed she did, and she did. And so I applied to go to clinical psychology, and I got in. I forgot, God knows how, even though I hadn't actually studied psychology. And so then you're back to the circuit where in Fordham and Johns Hopkins and McGill. So, but how did this get to meta research? Oops. And be carrying out how we do research is, when I went to Fordham, I didn't do any research until my thesis. It was a more clinical program. I did my thesis, I got through, and I had a clinical research post at Johns Hopkins as a postdoctoral fellow. And one of the first experiences I had, and I had some math background, and I'm reading through the research, and I'm looking at a senior person's research, and I'm saying, I'm looking at what you did, I'm looking at what you're saying. I don't think I understand, because they don't match, basically. And he said, well, no, you don't worry, you're right, but this is the message that's important that people get. Wow, this is I thought, not coming from per se the academy, I thought this seems to be not how we want to do things, right? That you decide what the message should be, and we put it out there, and just tell me, don't worry about it. This is the message people need to get about mental health. I had another experience there where I was looking at research and writing a letter to the editor. I wrote a letter to the editor about someone's work and suggested that there was a flaw that had actually made the results wrong. And they wrote a letter back and said how that I had been wrong, and they've checked everything out was okay. And I ran into this person at a Congress a few months later and said, oh, no, you were absolutely right, but we weren't going to admit that in public. Wow. So I'm getting my travel around the world, get into research now, and we're going to get it right. I was thrown a little bit, and then I think I got to McGill, and it's interesting. One of the first things that happened, when I had been a postdoc, I started working on a systematic review that ended up getting published in JAMA, not because it just had a lot of luck to it, and my advisor suggested, my mentor at Hopkins suggested to submit it there, and it was suggesting that we didn't have actually any evidence that depression screening actually improved mental health, which seems to still be the case. But it's not a very popular evidence base in our field. And it's interesting because I got to McGill, and one of the first experience I had, and this came, we actually looked at depression screening and cardiovascular care. Within 2 weeks, the American Heart Association released a guideline telling everyone to screen. They all came out together. So there was quite a bit of press and controversy. And I got emails from a senior person in the field telling me that she trusted that I would no longer pursue this and that I would support the people with the guideline, right? And then I had actually someone at McGill who's in some senior position who said, I trust that this is not good for your career. So there was a real disconnect. And I think, I had a really benefit of a good mentor, Roy Ziegelstein at Johns Hopkins, who was a cardiologist of all things. It wasn't my official mentor, but had picked me up along the way. And he said, no, do research. These people, you're not doing research for these people. You're doing, we'll talk about who we're doing research for, right, in a minute, and stick to it. I think that was some of the best advice I ever got. So anyway, but that's why those are some, I think, some experiences that led to why I'm so interested in getting research right and doing it the best we can. And so there's either as a psychologist, I have to take in the fact that maybe I just told you all that because I want to talk about myself as all as possible, but maybe it's also getting to why I think research is important and getting research right really matters. Okay. All right, so let's try something here. Let's do this Kahoot. So if you just go to, if you go to Kahoot IT, it's just Google Kahoot, or just put kahoot.it. We're gonna have a little quiz here. So you get 90 seconds to answer this. But what you do is it's gonna give you a game pin here. So if you put this pin, go to the website, put that pin in, and it's gonna ask you the question here. Oh, this really works. This is great. We'll just wait for a minute for people to log in. Okay, everyone's okay? You can go on? Okay. Oh, anyone else still need time to get in? All right, so well, wait a minute, because people are still getting in. All right, so let's go ahead and try this here. So this is going to cut you off after 90 seconds here. So the first question is, look, it's all drama. This is great. Okay, here. So what is the main reason we do health research? This should be simple, right? But if you're really sweating this, there's your countdown clock. So to put more pressure on you. You haven't done the answers. All right, there we go. All right, so all right, so we have to improve health, find solutions, better help patients, advance interventions, provide better health care, improve people's health, benefit others for science, advancing science. So we have a lot more, basically improving health outcomes that help people in society, right? Better health care, better outcomes. Okay, help others try to find answers. Putting resources in the right place that we're actually helping people's condition. That's an important one too. Okay, good. So I think we're all on the same page. And, oops, sorry about this. I don't want to be doing this one yet. Okay, don't do this one yet. We'll come back to that one. I'm not very good at navigating yet, sorry. All right, so why do we do, why do we do this? So basically, if you look at what CHR says, they're on the same page with you. We do health research to help people, to help benefit their health. So it's very simple, but it's really critical that, what we're doing should lead to people having better health. How's that? And that can be done through a number of ways. Through people mention interventions. Someone mentioned a really important one, allocating resources in the right places, right? We spend massive resources on things that don't help people, or that studies that repeat, or we'll get to this, I already know. And both CHR and FRQS have very similar, definitions, right? So we look to have strategies to help people. Well, it's actually not just health care, but lead healthier lives also, right? So that could be outside of the healthcare system, but have better health. And I think it's really critical to keep in mind, for who we do our research. We do it for the Canadian public. Often Canada's invested as a global citizen to do it to citizens in other countries. Yep, question? Yeah, sure. I can share those for sure. So yeah, we do research for people around the country, and these are just a group of people with scleroderma who participate in our work. And one of our, it's a picture we publish, but we do research, for them. But we do research everyone out there. And I think it's really important to keep in mind. I know as a check that I alluded to some of my things I mentioned before, the experiences I have, but these are so common, right? You're not doing research for peer reviewers from a specialist society who really like one message. They're a barrier to good research sometimes, right? So you think about if you publish in mental health and you show an intervention doesn't actually work very well, it's going to be trickier to get it through peer review. But you're not doing research for them, and sometimes some of our colleagues have become actually barriers to our research entity. But it's always good. I find it helps. It's always good to think of somebody. I had one of my grandmothers, who I love very much, grew up and worked in a factory and moved through depression and took care of me. And I always thought, could I tell her what we're doing right now? And so I think my grandmother. So that I get I think it's really important that, think about that. There's common citizens who go out to work, and we're very lucky. We're privileged. We have jobs. We sit here in an office. We get to think about fascinating things. We have pressure on us, right? It's not easy in that way. It's stressful and anxiety-provoking and high pressure sometimes. But you're not sitting in a grocery store checking someone out again and again and again, or lifting boxes, every day, or putting on a conveyor belt. So just for what it's worth, keep in mind, everyone like that is paying their money, that they work really hard for us to do this. So it's really critical that's who we serve. There's intermediaries that are supposed to make sure we serve them, departments in our institutions, and journals and journal editors, that some of them do it tremendously well, others do it less well, others do it very poorly, right? But in the end, you have to make the decisions that work. That's who we work for. So research waste is again, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today and getting your research right comes down to doing research that is non-wasteful. So this is a huge problem right now. It's a huge problem in research, a huge problem in healthcare. And if you follow the news, we're having a huge, terrible time right now sustaining our healthcare system, just because among other reasons, the dynamics of more people needing it, population shifts, and otherwise, it's a huge endeavor. The UK is like our system, but it's in one instead of we have our 10 provinces, right? So they tend to get in the news a little more clearly, but they're documenting really well how difficult it is. And research is part of that budget, and so we need to make sure that our research is used wisely. Because they're going to stop funding it, and we already have a crisis in how much is funded if it's not being used well, and also because it can be a huge driver of more effective healthcare and more efficient, healthcare. And efficient healthcare just doesn't mean that politicians are somehow moving it into their banquets. It means that we're in a one-payer system here. So if you're doing something, you're not doing something else, right? And we have all sorts of good things we could do for people that we can't afford to do. And so your research should be able to help us figure that stuff out. This is Lancet has run a few papers on research waste, including this one is a classic, is a great, easily read on research waste. Paul Glasso and Ian Chalmers led this, among some others. But here, they did a back of the envelope calculation on how much research is wasted. And it's not sophisticated, but it's probably pretty close. So just as a guess here, we'll go back into Kahoot here, and we'll try to see if I can get this going again. Oops. All right, so this is about 10 years ago, but the question is, this one's a multiple choice, so easy. what percentage of research, sorry, it's going to give you a new pin, I think, again. Sorry about that. Yeah, sorry, I'm making everyone log in again. This is good because if you didn't like your icon, you get a different one. Like if you didn't like being a moose, maybe you can be a gorilla. I don't, or a robot now. This is all right. I'm going to go ahead and start this up here. Okay, so here we go. So what percentage of health research did they estimate is wasted? Meaning it's not producing usable knowledge, right? So you have this one's 30 seconds. You've got to make your decision here. All right. So we have a spread across. No one thought 15%. But the right answer, well, they estimated 85% of health research doesn't produce usable knowledge. And let me clarify that. A null study, like a null, oh damn, I did this again, sorry. All right, we're just gonna skip this whole darn thing, sorry. I'm not good at, it's not just not practicing, I'm not good at detail type stuff like that anyway. Okay, so 85%. And we'll just go through here. So 85%, now what they did a back of the envelope, and it's not so hard. When they did this, you know, they based this on research. So about 50% of clinical trials that were started, to the best they could tell, were never published. So right off the bat, you've got half of research that's funded and done never into the public domain, right? Sorry about this. Okay, so yeah, so I don't know if they got this exactly right, but you know, if you're starting with 50% of studies that you do and spend resources on don't get published in some way, and again, this is 10 or 12 years, it was 2009, so about 14 years ago, but I suspect it's probably improved a little, but not a lot. So you're starting with 50% don't get published. And then you've got, you know, other sources, right? So you're asking questions that don't matter. So people are doing research studies that nobody really cares what the answer is. Either because, you know, and that's actually one of the things I showed you the paper that Tiffany did on meta-research when she was talking about people doing research on reporting guidelines. She reviewed 140 studies that studied how well people reported their studies. Every single one of them found that it was bad. So one of the things that Tiffany said, apart from the fact that they weren't reporting well, she said, do we need another study that shows that reporting is bad, or is this just more research waste? Do we already know the answer to this question? If we already know the answer, you're wasting people's resources to try to go out and reiterate it. Or nobody cares anyway. Like if I do research in scleroderma and I'm addressing something that the patients don't really care about, a symptom or a problem that's not such a problem for them, you know. Okay. Not using, this is a big one that, you know, the second one is, you know, using a design and methods that are going to actually allow you to get the answer to a question. And I think we all try to do the best we can do on that one. So that's one of the ones that we're going to have to just assume we're all doing the best we can. That's really hard, right? I mean, you know, you go out and consult with people, we'll talk about it. But, you know, another source is people aren't actually publishing their research studies. So depending on what they find, the studies never make their way into a format where anybody can actually see what happened. And the reports, when they are generated, another source of waste is that they're often don't give you enough information to know what actually went on in the study. Or, it's funny, like we call this misreporting in science. I think it's fraud, right? If you measured 10 outcomes and you're telling people there was only 2 and they both look good, out in the real world, that's fraudulent, right? In ours, we call it misreporting as if it were a mistake, but that happens a lot. So we're either getting reports that don't tell us enough to know what happened, or mislead us about what actually happened and what was found, right? So these all can lead to research waste. So I showed you data from 14 years ago, and is research waste still a problem? And if you look back on COVID, there have been some fascinating stories. There's controversy about vaccines, but I mean, I think the fact that they got these vaccines out as quickly as they did was pretty miraculous in some of what they did. We've seen some of the most ambitious and well-executed trials ever. The UK did the recovery trials, where they basically, if you'll see here, they published many different trials, but they had something called a platform, where most of the hospitals in the UK were enrolling anyone hospitalized with COVID, and they were moving treatments in and out and getting big studies, one after the other one. It was one of the again, it's hard to do, like every hospital is doing this in the UK, but they were again, just really tremendous efforts and thinking and smart people working really hard to get this. But at the same time, there was still a tremendous amount of waste, right? I think it's gotten into the press, many duplicative studies, poorly designed trials, stuff was launched without thinking. Everyone's seen this, it was disseminated without vetting, right? Stuff got into preprints and got in the press and turned out to be wrong. And a lot of it's been retracted even. People might have seen this in the news. There's something called Retraction Watch, which is a pretty interesting website. But this is that's numbers 1 to 3. They've listed 365 COVID papers that were retracted as basically fraudulent in most cases. Some had some big mistakes. Most of them were stuff where their data weren't real. And this there's a nice article in Science on this, but 2 huge medical journals got burned. Maybe people will remember this. There was a group in the US that had said they had hospital data from hundreds of hospitals, and again, we're moving very fast. No one asked, how do you have hospital data from hundreds of hospitals and nobody knows about this? And they published these findings on some of the COVID treatments, what was happening in the hospitals. And then some, people who know data patterns, and said, this doesn't look right. We want to see the data. And of course, there were no data. Or they couldn't produce any data. Let's assume that there were no data. And this is actually this is big. I have to say, we do a lot of evidence synthesis now. And every evidence synthesis now, we pull up fake studies. It's become an increasingly big problem where we have to go back. It takes a lot of time and energy. You can't just declare something fake. You've got to go back to the journal and anyway, pursue this, but it's becoming a big problem. What about in mental health, right? How much waste is there? So this was a huge concern in COVID. I mean, apart from getting the disease and being crippled or disability from the disease or dying from the virus, this was the next biggest concern, I think, easily on everybody's mind, was mental health. Our group worked on what was supposed to be a living systematic review, meaning you update as evidence comes in, but so much evidence came in and such bad quality, it's not really living. It's not dead either, but we were updating as we can, not as, we had no idea coming how fast we'd be. We thought we could update it every month or something. That was not going to happen. And in fact, our team's gone through 150,000 studies at this point, looking for evidence. And we published, it took us a long time to put this together. We published, we compared, we wanted to see how much mental health had changed. We looked at studies that compared mental health before the pandemic to during the pandemic. Fairly simple design, but out of all those studies we had to go through, we only had 134 cohorts. We're up to about double that now. We're going to republish and update, but we only got 134 cohorts out of like 100,000 papers we went through. And this is one of the pages about something called the risk of bias table. People familiar with risk of bias? But basically you go through and look at the studies you find, and you rate them on different characteristics that tell you how confident you can be that the findings are likely to represent what's actually going on out there in the world, how valid they likely are. And you'll see this is checkered with some big no's and unclears. 2 studies are, I guess, all the way across. It's actually the same cohort from the Netherlands. It's 2 different populations they published that we use. But all told, in the 134 studies, we only had 2 large national cohorts that we thought, okay, these are well-conducted national level cohorts. There's another one from the UK, that are giving us evidence that we can have a pretty good idea that this is representing what's happened here. You know, so out of all the attention to mental health and COVID, there was really a problem. There wasn't a lot. In fact, our conclusions were that our first line of our conclusions in this paper were that high risk of bias, you know, limited what we could actually say about it. We didn't find there were very big changes. We find there were probably minimal to small changes, but we didn't think that we could actually make a precise estimate in any population just because of all the problems with the data. So, I mean, we could be pretty confident that there wasn't at the population level, there wasn't a huge change, but that's really all we could say with any confidence. And you know, but there were thousands and thousands of studies out there that were running around making claims, right? This is just one example. I could have picked out many meta-analyses. Like, people were running around doing studies that said, we gave a questionnaire out and 40% of the people were above a score of 10. Therefore, there's a crisis. But I think everyone knows, like, if you have to assess change, you need to know what happened before and what happened during. And our questionnaires in mental health are all gauged differently. In any given time, you know, questionnaires are going to give you rates that are all over the map. I just reviewed a paper in one of the larger general medicine journals where someone claimed that a particular marginalized group was under crisis in COVID because they had 50% depression rates. What the person didn't put in their paper was that they had published that the rate was 60% 2 years before COVID with another questionnaire. So, you know, it depends. Whatever questionnaire you administer drives the rates, and if you don't have change, you can't talk about change. But all these systematic reviews, massive numbers of studies would come out with people doing cross-sectional studies. And you can do cross-sectional studies, but you just can't claim what that means. And if you look at this one, this was just one example. They had, I don't know, they had many studies. I forget how many, but I looked at there were several dozen studies that had at least 1,000 participants, and they reported prevalence of depression from 12 to 87%. Go make a policy on that one, right? So I think this is probably clear this is pretty wasteful work, right, that was going on. Simon Gilbody's group wrote about this too. Like, you know, if you're in the area of vaccines or COVID treatments, and you say, what were the key trials here? People can tell you what the key trials were in those areas in COVID, right? And they're saying, you know, where were the mental health trials? Can anyone here, okay, let's say for instance, what did we need in COVID? We didn't need trials. A lot of you, I assume, have clinical training, right? Marie-Claude does. Okay. You know how to treat someone for anxiety in a one-to-one setting, in an encounter. We know that you can do that. We know that it's effective. We didn't really need to know that you could still do that in COVID, like you hadn't lost your skills along the way. But what I think it's safe to say, we anticipate there's a lot more burden on people. And we needed ways to get mental health access to large numbers of people in a way that could be feasibly sustained, right, economically and so forth. Does that sound reasonable, right? That's what we needed. Can anyone name a mental health trial that did that? Anyone off you're all in, how many people are in mental health, by the way? Okay, so about a third to half people. Okay, can anyone name the Hallmark trial in COVID that did that? Anyone? We have some senior people here. I'll put pressure on you. Any Hallmark trials on Marie-Claude? Any Hallmark mental health trials? Yeah, so I think, you know, we really dropped the ball. We published a study on, one of our students published, where our conclusion was ignore this evidence. There's 50 trials on people doing mental health with people in the hospital. And we had so many, one of the problems we had in doing this work is actually that a lot of the trials were clearly fake. A lot, actually, this one. And it could be where they came from. Some countries are different. We have different ways of cheating. In Canada, we kind of cheat by leaving out outcomes and things like that. In some countries where there are different structures, and they cheat by making data up altogether. I don't think people are very different. Some people do the right thing and some don't. But there were lots of trials that were clearly made up that never happened. And so we had to get around that and sort it out. And we couldn't, you know, we said people should refer to common sense and existing recommendations pre-COVID on what to do with people in the hospital. Ignore these data. We're updating this now, but we have about 350 trials that we've looked through. And if you're, sorry, this is from we published an early paper on your left on COVID mental health trials. And we only found at that point 3 reasonably done trials, but only 2 of them were very useful, honestly. One of ours has 2 lines. It's great. It was a nice trial. We worked in a rare disease. We've already trained like 200 support group leaders around the world. We have a support group leader training programs tested. So we harnessed that and put in a patient-driven intervention. It's a neat trial that if you actually have like a rare disease with support group leaders, you can do it, but that's not going to solve, that's not the kind of trial we're looking for. The one on the bottom is Texas. That was actually a really nice trial. They actually went out to, people who were homebound in Meals on Wheels and had phone calling. So that might be a useful trial, right? You could do phone calls and do that. There's a brilliant trial from Sweden. These are too small for you to see. You'll have to trust me, it's there. I'll give you the slides. It was a brilliant trial because they actually worked with the government. They put together a CBT for anxiety. They tailored the anxiety stuff to COVID-related anxiety. They worked with the government. They delivered it to about 500 or 600 people in the trial, and then they plan to roll it out to the public afterwards. Perfect. So that's the only trial I know of that actually did kind of what we really needed out there out of all this, okay? So I think research waste is huge still. And this is the last comment on that. Again, these are the Canadian Task Force on Preventive Healthcare I mentioned is what puts out huge guidelines, right? All the cancer screening and things like that. And most of our, I'm no longer on the member, but I was, most of the guidelines have weak recommendations, they're called, or conditional recommendations, because even on those big topics, the quality of the evidence is so low, and the U.S. Task Force puts out a massive amount of guidelines, and they have a similar, a lot of the guidelines say that we can't draw conclusions because we don't have enough evidence that we trust on these important topics. So what do we do about all of this? You know, I think there's 4 main areas. We'll talk about 3 of them today. You know, there's asking questions that matter. The second area here on the bottom is, you know, appropriate design and methods. And again, I think that we all do the best we can. So we're not gonna. I don't have all the answers for using the best design and methods, and we couldn't teach it in the seminar anyway. But it's also about then reporting, right? How you completely and transparently document your work, because that's one of the biggest reasons that things get thrown out. Studies might have been done reasonably well, but as an evaluator who's actually going to make a guideline, again, virtually nobody's going to act on your study, even if it's a big trial. People are going to put together evidence and evaluate it and see if they can use it, and most studies get thrown out at that level. They just get tossed because we don't know what happened there, okay? And this is what we'll talk about today. Making sure that you ask a reasonable question and document your study transparently and completely enough that people can actually use your work, right? Okay, so how can we reduce waste? So this is maybe a quick recipe, right? You want to select a topic and a program that matter for doing research. You want to choose a question that you can answer in a way that provides useful information, right? I mean, if you're a graduate student doing your thesis, you probably don't want to have your topic being, how can I reduce obesity in Canada? It's a huge topic, right? It's too big. You can't, even though it's an important question, you probably can't answer it given your resources as a grad student, right? Although you could answer a small part of that, maybe. And I'll skip, for the methods and design stuff, all I want to say is, do team science, get people who know, right? We're putting together a study now, like I've been doing this for a while, and I have a fair amount of quantitative background. It's like I never go into study without a good biostatistician. I'm starting in with a good rheumatologist, with a patient team that looks at everything we're asking and doing. You get all the advice you can and find people. And a lot of people here are young investigators or students. I can tell because you look a little younger than I do. You know, people, if you prepare yourself and do your homework, you'd be surprised how willing people are to work with you. People like to work with young people who are well prepared and working hard and doing their homework. I mean, I was on a trial at McGill a few years ago with a very, very young person. I looked at the other people she had in the room, and she had like 3 good trials in them. But she, you know, she prepared herself, did her homework, asked a reasonable question, and was persistent. So get help that you need. All of us need to get help. And as a young person, don't think you have to do this on your own. You know, talk to your mentor, anyway, that's all I'll say on methods. But how else can we reduce waste? So develop and make publicly available a protocol. You know, we'll talk about this today, prior to starting your study, and carefully documenting changes to it. If you don't show your protocol to anybody, it doesn't exist, right? Register your study. if it's a clinical trial or systematic review, and I'll talk a little bit about where you can register and what the difference between registration and protocol is. And use reporting guidelines to make sure that you actually, if you've done all this hard work, you write it up in a way that somebody will use it. Not somebody who's reading it and says, oh, I like what they found, therefore I'm going to cite it all the time. Somebody who's actually going to integrate it into a decision making, which is what you want to have happen with your study. And finally, this is the last one's a new one, and not so new, but a new one is make your data available ongoing and share your data. Okay? All right. So again, selecting your topic, talk to your mentor or colleagues, do your homework. If you're picking your topic, how do you pick your topic, right? So it's useful. Always find a scoping review or a systematic review. You know, every single introduction or rationale for a paper should say what the existing evidence says from a systematic review on what you're going to do, or that there isn't one, and then you're going to tell us that there isn't one, and here are a couple of big studies and what they found. Don't, you know, that's really, really critical, right? If you're going into an area, sometimes a common scenario is that you're going into a study and saying, there's a systematic review of 10 studies and they all found different things. Therefore, I'm going to do the 11th study. And my reaction is usually like, oh, so you're going to throw one more on the trash heap. So it's actually a really good reason to do the 11th study, but synthesize, right? Make sure you understand why you're doing it. What was wrong with the first 10? Were they too small? You've got to figure out why something is wrong. If you can't figure out what's wrong, if they're getting all sorts of different results, or what might be wrong, then don't do the 11th one until you can, right? Just figure out why you're doing it. Get experts involved. Ask people questions. I mean, when I started my career at Hopkins, and you won't be able to figure out who this is from my CV, so I can say it, but my mentor dropped off the map. And I cold emailed people back then and asked if I could use data and things like that. And people will be surprised, not everybody, but people are surprisingly supportive or asking questions and helping, right? Work through your mentors and then go and get other advice also. And engage with the people who know the field. Engage with patients, engage with healthcare providers if you're doing that kind of research. So I just want to talk a little bit about this again, how do you pick the right question? And I want to emphasize this just because this is a topic that is really, I think, important. We all say right now that we should be engaging patients. CHR wants you to engage patients. We all put them on our grants. And we're doing some meta research right now and looking at who actually engages patients in the research. We've gone through published rheumatology and mental health research, and if they don't tell us if they engage patients, we've contacted authors, and most people don't. So patients can be engaged, and I use patients, but it could be different stakeholders, right, depending on what you're doing. It's not always patients. But I'll use that term just because it's simple and it's what we do. But people can, of course, if you're doing a study, they're participants in the study, but there's also really important ways they can be engaged, and there's some easy ways to do this too. You know, we've tried to do consultation as a lower level of engagement. We just ask people. So we're connected into the scleroderma community, and we've done surveys on what we should be researching. What are topics that we tell people what kind of capacity we have as an organization. We can't do drug research or fundamental medical research in our organization. It's oriented towards patient-important outcomes, and we do physical therapy and psychology and things like that. So we did a survey, and we got some great ideas actually that helped us understand that that people said there's nothing on their faces change in all sorts of ways, and there's all sorts of mouth stuff, and there's nothing out there. And they told us that, and we said, oh yeah, why didn't we think of that? Well, because there it is. Collaboration is another level, and this again, I think this is usually pretty accessible if you really work at. You can find people to do this. Every time we start a project, we're starting to work now on pain and scleroderma more. We have a specific advisory team for our team, and when we first started out, we come in with some basic schematic of what we think the topic is, but we ask them what the questions are. We ask them to review our work. And this is an aside, we usually have a couple of ringers. We have some people that work with us a lot. They know how to work with us. They're confident at telling us when we're wrong. And then we usually try to have 5 or 6 people who haven't worked with us before. But having people who, as you get farther along, having people that you can count on telling you you're wrong, and emphasize to them that you really need them to tell you when you're wrong, because we get it wrong a fair amount. When we went into COVID, we did a trial, and our primary outcome was anxiety. And it was a combination of expert mental health coming into support groups and support group leaders. And the first weeks of COVID, we went to our patient advisors and said, we would have used depression. They're all going to be lonely, they're isolated. They're particularly vulnerable in COVID because it's an autoimmune disease, they have lung disease. We think they're going to be isolated, we're going to do depression. They said, they were really clear. They said, no, you've got this wrong. We're used to that. We're used to being ourselves. Everyone's scared to death. You need to do anxiety. And then when we actually track the data, anxiety in the first weeks of COVID shot up, depression, flat. So don't lose this opportunity. So when you're doing your research questions and defining your study, I mean, that was just one example. There's other examples where they've made sure we get things right. And actually, we've started to write, I can go on and on about this topic, but we're writing a paper up now, and I think I want to put a section. You know how you have your discussion, your main results, how it fits into other research, what implications are. I think we're going to put in a specific section on patient interpretation, right? What they told us this means and how, right? And get that voice come through. Not because I think it's, for research, it's about expediency and getting it right. It's not just to give them a voice. I don't find myself like I'm giving someone a voice. I think they know a lot, and it really matters a lot, and so that should come through in there. And then finally, they can actually be involved in leadership. So we have a steering committee. Again, this is a bigger organization. It takes a while to get here. But we have patients on we started out with a patient advisory board and a steering committee, and then it seemed silly because we were going like this. So we have about almost half our steering committee are people with scleroderma. And that's actually really important because they have decision making on where we put our funds, what topics we pick, et cetera. And they make researchers behave way better. Like we're in a net, not all of us are. We're in a network that's across the scleroderma community. There's a couple pirates out there that you don't want to. They're not the greatest people to work with, and they behave way better. They're a lot less selfish when they're in a room with patients. So anyway, that's an aside. They kind of help us figure out what it is that we're doing. All right, about 15 more minutes, and we'll take a break. Okay. All right. Any questions or comments so far? Yeah, the front and then the back. Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So I don't actually see patients. So I was trained clinically and did clinical work, and I came here as hired as a researcher. But so we're pretty much for whatever it's worth, we've been working with patient organizations as the first step from way back. So we had patient organization people would talk to us. And then we began to ask them to help us recruit people. So that's where we started. Could you put out a call for us or any people in your organization? As we've gone farther along, at some point we found like we had all these people we work with all the time. We love working with them. So then we've evolved over the years. We started probably 12 or 13 years ago now. Now we have a social media outreach, and we have people that are not associated with it follow us. So now we put out calls. We try to find people that we don't know, too. And we basically put out calls periodically. Say we're interested in people who might help with research. These are some potential topics that we might address. Which ones might you be interested in, please? And someone on our team does a quick screening. The screening is, and we try to get people that are as diverse as possible with their disease severity, their economic well-being, where they're from, and race, ethnicity, whatever we can. And then this quick screening is basically like, can you get through a 5-minute call without raising a red flag that you're going to disrupt a group? That's our only screener, really. And then in terms of what we funded, we know it's funny, when we first started, they were all people that were really involved in the organization. They insisted we not pay them. They wanted to put it back in, but that's evolved over time. And so we've now, more recently, a few years ago, we actually fund as a stipend for their time. And we put that into our grants too. Anytime they put in, I think it's a minimal stipend. It's like $25 an hour or something. Is that, yeah? Okay. And then yeah. participate this, we have a little